All right, thank you very much. So thank you for having me here. I take advantage of this occasion to discuss this paper I'm developing. And I think this is a very valuable venue, as it's actually a rare occasion to actually practice interdisciplinarity, to engage with scholars from other disciplines, to read their work beyond the lip service we normally have to pay to interdisciplinarity as academics. So I think this is a kind of a rare occasion, rare setting, and at least speaking as a historian, and I welcome it. So the paper I'm working on consists essentially in an attempt to test the notion of illiberalism in the arena of history. And the hopes I have is that on the one hand, this will test its efficacy and usefulness in reading historical material and situations. So to see whether it's a category that can, open up new perspectives in the historical field. But on the other hand, conversely, I want to see if this historical approach can help the political science literature in one of the most difficult tasks, which I seem to have identified by reading some of this literature, namely the task of defining this concept, right? So on this count, what I hope this paper will end up doing is to drive home the point that this notion of illiberalism is embedded in a particular historicity. So in a particular narrative, a narrative not only about 20th century European history, but a broader one about European modernity. So if I am successful in proving this point, then I hope to do another more critical operation, which is the standard operations that historians try to do. So to shed doubts on the consistency, the coherence, and the closedness of this narrative, showing its contingency and what it leaves out. And I hope this will become clearer as I speak further. So my paper focuses on a thinker which has good credentials to be classified as a proto-illiberal, as even a father of illiberalism, if you want to be a bit rhetorical, and which has been called in similar ways or close enough to the father of illiberalism, a guy called Georges Sorel. So he was a fierce critic of parliaments, of bourgeois democratic culture, one in which the rhetoric about the corruption and moral pettiness of liberal society that animates a lot of contemporary illiberal discourse was found in abundance. And yet, as you might have guessed, the story I want to tell is not just the story of a historical precedent, because historical precedents are almost never fully correct, and because it is actually more interesting to develop a more complicated story. So what I try to argue is that Sorel's criticism of parliamentary democracy in its context of production, which is the French Third Republic, was animated by essentially liberal concerns for autonomy. Sorel witnessed and participated in what is, I would say, the major democratic experiment in 19th century Europe, and came to the conclusion that the practices of electoral democracy disempowered both individuals and, more importantly, groups, collectives, in their capacity for self-direction and self-rule. And I will say a bit more about this in the second part of my paper. So Sorel's critique is interesting in its own right, because it is a rare, non-elitist critique of mass democracy. The standard liberal critique of mass democracy is fear of these mobs who cannot think, and what are they going to do? Sorel's criticism is liberal, but it's different. And it has affinities, and here I'm just basically thinking aloud, maybe with 20th century right-wing libertarianism, and it comes from a broader kind of federalist vision of democracy, which I would like to explore more in depth. But the point of my story is really not just Sorel, and not even mainly Sorel. It is rather how Sorel was read in the 20th century, first in the interwar period by contemporaries and commentators, and secondly by historians after World War II, and political activists in the 80s, mostly on the right. So what do we see if we follow this reception? We find something interesting. We find the forgetting of Sorel's liberal concerns, and the gradual construction of Sorel, first as an enemy of democracy more than a socialist, and this is correct, he was an enemy of democracy, and secondly as an enemy of this concept, which you can see indirectly emerging if you follow this reception, this concept of liberal democracy, right? By following this reception, in other words, we can see indirectly how specific category of liberal democracy is gradually constructed. And importantly, how this category is embedded in what I called earlier a specific historicity, a specific reading of the European 20th century. So where we find Sorel is almost invariably always in this kind of genealogical constructions of liberal democratic society, something which didn't necessarily exist as a concept when Sorel was writing, although it did, but we'll get to this later. So it's almost invariably in the middle of these genealogies and these attempts to historicize the European 20th century that we find Sorel being pitched as on the side of, and here I'm quoting from a 1950s edition of Sorel's Reflections on Violence, published in America, amongst the enemies of free society. So how does this interact with the literature on illiberalism? It does interact because it highlights how a central core of this concept, and I dare to say a central core also of the political practice of illiberalism, is built on a specific historicity, a specific temporality, which sees democracy and liberalism as essentially symbiotic, okay? This temporality, this historical narrative is typical of the late 20th century, but I would like to say it's not exclusive to it. I'm not talking about a historical period. I'm talking about a way to frame history, which we find in the late 20th century, but we found also before. So I would argue that it's something that has to do with the collapse of communism, the kind of Fukuyama moment, but also something that was already there in the 1890s in different ways. Now, I know that in political science literature, there is a talk about illiberal democracy, and that if I say that the literature sees liberalism and democracy as symbiotic, I'm doing a bit of violence to it, that there is a discussion of the potential clashes between these two concepts. And yet I would, and in fact, one could say that the whole point of illiberalism, both as a scholarly endeavor and as a political practice, is to highlight these tensions between democracy and liberalism. And yet I will stick to my point. The background historical imaginary on which something like illiberalism can develop is a specific one. It's an optimistic story about the realization of principle of popular sovereignty, emancipation, and autonomy. So in an interesting piece which I read in the political science literature, the political scientist Marlène Laruelle argues that essential to the label of illiberalism is the experience of free democratic qualities. I'm quoting here. In describing illiberalism as post-liberal, I mean it pushes back against liberalism after having experienced it. This post aspect is critical because it explains the disillusioned tone of illiberalism. So I would like to advance a similar argument for what concerns the historicity in which illiberalism operates. I would like to advance the argument that both the practice and theorization of illiberalism cannot be disconnected from what in our period we may call the Fukuyama moment, which is not just a moment of historical triumph of liberal democracy, but also a moment that starts to postulate, as I said, symbiotic relation between liberalism and democracy. I repeat, I'm not just talking about an historical period. I think that, in fact, if you study the fin de siècle and the two fin de siècles, the fin of the 19th and the fin of the 20th, you see similar historicities, right? Obviously, contents are different and historical experiences are different, but there is a substantial enough similarity that, that it's worth inquiring more. What I want to show in this paper then is essentially the construction of part of this narrative, its 20th century version, through an examination of the reception of Sorel, first in the interwar period and then in the 60s and 70s. As a good historian, I want to warn about the dangers of narratives, showing that at least in the case of Sorel, they leave out something important. So these two ambitions, possibly contradictory, to show the importance of the narrative in creating a kind of fertile environment for illiberalism, both as an academic study and a political practice, but also to warn about like what the narrative misses. So these are basically the ambitions. How much time do I have left?
7 minutes.
Perfect. And and so basically these are the ambitions. And now I want to talk very quickly about the content of the paper very shortly in 5 minutes. So it's divided in 4 sections, 4 sections. The first section, no, 4 sections. The first one is basically a more polished restatement of what I just said now. The second one is a presentation of the context in which Sorel operated, so the French Third Republic. As I said, this is the most advanced democratic experiment in the whole of 19th century Europe, I would say. The only exception I can think of is the United States of America. I wouldn't even say that Britain is so interesting from the point of view of democracy, definitely not Germany. And so I want to characterize this democratic experiment as essentially by 2 features. First, it's a democracy of mass opinion, right? It's a democracy which doesn't really have what we would call 20th century parties, so complex organizations, but it has political mobilization on the basis of issues, right? So a big role for public discussion, a big role for the press, and these are like the structures of democratic mobilization in this period, at least until First World War. And secondly, a second characteristic, which is a context in which you have the first evolution in the development of a centralist interventionist state, both in economic terms, but also in educational terms. This is very important. So I want to characterize the French experiment in this way. And then the second section will outline Sorel's critique of it, which is very virulent, bordering on the anti-Semitic in some points of his career. But really, I want to kind of highlight a different aspect, which is essentially a criticism of democracy as a system of manipulation, right? As a system that deprives people and groups of autonomy. So things like the press and the press and public discussion are seen by Sorel as kind of manipulating publics, right? As devices which remove the autonomy of readers. And secondly, political parties and the state. Sorel develops this critique of democratic society as a type of political environment where there are incentives to group in order to capture the state, capture the capacities of the state. And this he hates because he's an anti-statist. He comes from a tradition of liberalism, which is very fearful of the state. And it's almost comical to see it in the 1890s because it's not the 1930s. Feels paranoid at the time, but with what happens later, actually feels quite prescient. So in both of these dynamics, we see a loss of autonomy, individual in the case of the press, collective in the case of parties and as devices of state capture. And this is the second section, the third section. And the fourth section is the main meat of the paper, which is the reception. And there is a lot to talk about here. I'll try to be brief. Basically, what I want to do in this section is to show how the differences which were operative in the 1890s between a liberal concern for autonomy and this new political environment, which is mass democracy, are gradually annihilated, smoothened out in the interwar and in the 50s and in the 60s, as new historical experiences arise, right? So for example, and I identify 3-4 moments here. And I'm trying to answer the question, what is Sorel to his readers, to his younger readers? And we find the first moment, which is as Sorel is still alive, so in the Belle Époque, before the war, where Sorel stands essentially for the new. Obviously, every one of these readers interprets the new in their own way, right? But Sorel becomes a symbol of breaking with 19th century liberalism, right? In terms of political thought, in terms of culture. So a lot of avant-gardists are drawn to Sorel, people who are not even particularly interested in political thought, but who feel a certain tiredness with the 19th century. People like T.S. Eliot, for example, reads a lot of Sorel and basically interprets him as like the radical break. Not interesting what comes afterwards, the importance of the break. A second moment I want to identify is just after the war, And it's essentially a similar moment, but on a more gloomy tone, where Sorel becomes a kind of figure a la Spengler, right? A prophet that Cassandra, right? Rails against all the corruption of our civilization, and look where it took us, right? And obviously, after the war, there is a very fertile environment for this type of discourse. It's not very different from the avant-gardist Belle Epoque figure. It's just the tone is different. What unites these two figures is that there is a relationship to something which we can call Western civilization, we can call liberal democracy, we can call however we want, but we kind of get what it is. It's the liberal 19th century. And then from 1926 onwards, something new happens. And this brings even more distortion to the thought of Sorel. What happens is that Sorel is seen as this figure of alterity towards the bourgeois 19th century. First in an optimistic avant-gardist tone, then in a kind of catastrophist post-war tone, but as an alternative. But there are no alternatives until at least 1917. So by 1925, when these two alternatives to parliamentary system are not just experiments, but they have acquired some substance, and I'm talking about Bolshevik Russia and Bolshevik Russia and fascist Italy, as these two alternatives acquire some historical substance, then Sorel becomes this illiberal, right? Then we have the creation of this oppositional concept of liberal democracy, right? And Sorel gets lumped as a father of totalitarianism, right? Totalitarianism is not the word that is used, but it's kind of the concept that is used. And here there are interesting things which I do not have the time to go into. I'll just mention one final moment of this reception, which is in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And it's the historiography dedicated to Sorel by two Jewish intellectuals, actually. Israeli historian Zeev Sterner and Baltic Jew Isaiah Berlin in Britain. They both talk about Sorel, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but what I want to highlight is they both talk about Sorel as part of histories of modernity. Sternel does a very long, dedicates most of his life to the ideology of fascism, right? And by the time that he gets to his intellectual maturity, this has become a history of counter-enlightenment, and his last book is called The Anti-Enlightenment. So it's a whole intellectual history of European modernity, and that's where Sorel is mobilized. Similar structure for Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin is much more lenient towards this counter-enlightenment. He sees it as something which is at least potentially positive. But again, Sorel is mobilized in this big genealogy of modernity. And I do not think this is a coincidence. So to close and to restate my aims, I want to show the construction of this historicity, of this narrative of liberal bourgeois triumph, and how this is the type of historicity which is required for illiberalism. And if this paper comes out well, I want to have time at the end of the paper to explore similarities and differences between the fin de siècle, where there is a similar crisis of this optimistic narrative, and now where we are definitely past Fukuyama, I would say, right? We don't have that optimism anymore. Thank you very much.